May 2nd, 1945. The Soviet forces are closing in on Ravensbrück concentration camp. Inside the compound, chaos reigns as the Nazi regime collapses around them. Female guards who once wielded absolute power over thousands of prisoners now face their own reckoning. Some attempt to flee. Others destroy evidence. A few choose to stay and face whatever comes next. What happened in those final 24 hours before liberation would determine the fate of some of the most notorious female perpetrators in Nazi Germany. The choices they made, the lies they told, and the desperate measures they took would echo through history and into the courtrooms of post-war justice. This is the story of those final hours, when the hunters became the hunted. By early May 1945, the writing was on the wall for Ravensbrück. The concentration camp, located about 50 miles north of Berlin, had served as the primary detention center for female prisoners since 1939. Now, with Allied forces advancing from all directions, the camp's administrative machinery was grinding to a halt. The sound of distant artillery had been growing louder for days. Camp Commandant Fritz Surin knew that evacuation was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity, but the logistics of moving tens of thousands of prisoners while maintaining operational security presented an almost impossible challenge. Among the female guards, panic was beginning to set in. These women, who had spent years implementing the brutal policies of the Reich, suddenly found themselves facing an uncertain future. Many had joined the camp system for economic reasons, drawn by steady wages and housing during wartime. Others had been motivated by ideological fervor. Now, regardless of their original motivations, they all faced the same terrifying prospect: capture by Allied forces. The camp housed approximately 550 female guards at its peak, ranging from senior supervisors to newly recruited auxiliaries. These women came from diverse backgrounds: former factory workers, domestic servants, nurses, and even some with higher education. What united them was their willing participation in a system designed to dehumanize and eliminate those deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Oberofficerin Johanna Langfeld had already been transferred away from the camp months earlier, but her replacement, Maria Mandl, remained in charge of the female guard contingent. Mandl, an Austrian woman who had earned a reputation for particular cruelty, understood that her actions at Ravensbrück would likely result in serious consequences if she fell into Allied hands. The Austrian-born Mandl had arrived at Ravensbrück in 1938 and quickly established herself as one of the most feared figures in the camp. Her methodical approach to prisoner management had earned her rapid promotion through the ranks. She was known for her meticulous record-keeping and her ability to maintain discipline among both prisoners and guards. But it was her personal involvement in selections for punishment and elimination that would later make her one of the most wanted war criminals. The camp's records department worked frantically to destroy documentation. Thousands of files detailing medical experiments, execution orders, and prisoner transfers were fed into furnaces. The smoke from burning documents created a haze that hung over the compound, a visible symbol of the regime's desperate attempt to erase its crimes. The destruction of evidence was not random, but carefully orchestrated. Priority was given to eliminating documents that directly implicated specific guards in particular atrocities. Personal files, correspondence, and disciplinary records were burned first, followed by operational documents and prisoner records. The guards understood that these papers could serve as evidence in any future legal proceedings. But the female guards faced a more immediate problem than document destruction. Unlike their male counterparts, who might blend into the general population of defeated German soldiers, the women guards were a distinctive group. Their uniforms, their positions, and their faces were known to thousands of surviving prisoners who could potentially identify them. The camp's proximity to Berlin made the situation even more precarious. The capital was under siege, and refugees were streaming through the area in increasing numbers. The roads that might have served as escape routes were clogged with military vehicles, civilian refugees, and the remnants of government officials fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. Some guards began discussing escape plans. The idea of fleeing eastward, away from the advancing Soviets, became increasingly appealing. But the roads were clogged with refugees, and travel without proper documentation was dangerous. German military police were still active in some areas, and desertion remained a capital offense. The guards' quarters became centers of whispered conversations and desperate planning. Maps were studied, routes were discussed, and alliances were formed and broken as women calculated their chances of survival. The solidarity that had existed among the guards during their years of service was beginning to fracture under the pressure of imminent capture. As night fell on May 1st, the tension in the guards' quarters was palpable. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would determine their survival, or their doom. The careful hierarchy that had defined their professional relationships was dissolving as each woman focused on her own desperate circumstances. The night of May 1st to 2nd became a turning point for many of the female guards at Ravensbruck. As darkness fell, small groups gathered in barracks and administrative buildings, whispering about options that seemed to grow more limited by the hour. Dorothea Binns, one of the most feared guards in the camp, spent the evening in her quarters systematically destroying personal items that might link her to specific atrocities. Binns, who had started as a trainee guard in 1939 and risen through the ranks, understood that her reputation preceded her. Prisoners had nicknamed her the Binns, and spoke of her involvement in selections for the gas chambers that had been constructed in early 1945. The 24-year-old Binns had joined the camp system straight from her work as a domestic servant. Her rise through the ranks had been meteoric, driven by her willingness to implement even the most brutal policies without question. She had developed a reputation for creative punishments and had been personally involved in the selection of prisoners for medical experiments. Her youth and apparent enthusiasm for her duties had made her particularly notorious among the prisoner population. Unlike some of her colleagues who were paralyzed by indecision, Binns took action. She gathered civilian clothes and false identification papers that had been prepared weeks earlier. Her plan was simple: shed her uniform, assume a false identity, and disappear into the chaos of collapsing Germany. The false papers had been obtained through a network of connections that extended beyond the camp. Some guards had used their positions to cultivate relationships with local officials, black market dealers, and even resistance members who could provide documentation for the right price. The irony that some guards were now dependent on the very underground networks they had once persecuted was not lost on the more thoughtful among them. Other guards chose different paths. Some, particularly those from the local area, decided to return to their families and hoped that their service at the camp would be forgotten or overlooked. They reasoned that female guards might be treated more leniently than their male counterparts, and that the chaos of the German collapse would provide cover for their escape. Greta Bösel, a senior guard who had been at the camp since 1940, chose this approach. She had maintained contact with her family in the nearby town of Fürstenberg throughout her service, and believed that returning home would provide the best chance of avoiding capture. Bösel had been involved in the camp's administrative operations and had detailed knowledge of the prisoner transport system. Her hope was that her lack of direct involvement in the most brutal aspects of the camp's operations would protect her from serious consequences. But not all guards were thinking of flight. A small group, led by senior guard Elizabeth Clem, made a calculated decision to remain at their posts. Clem, who had been at Ravensbrück since 1940, believed that staying and cooperating with Allied forces might result in more lenient treatment than being captured while fleeing. Clem's reasoning was based on her understanding of international law and the Geneva Convention. She had received some education before joining the camp system, and believed that guards who remained at their posts and cooperated with liberating forces might be treated as prisoners of war rather than war criminals. Her plan was to present herself as a reluctant participant who had been forced to serve against her will. The guards' discussions that night revealed the different ways they rationalized their service. Some claimed they were just following orders and had no choice in their actions. Others insisted they had tried to help prisoners when possible and had been forced to participate in the camp's brutal regime. A few acknowledged their roles, but claimed they had been necessary to maintain order and prevent chaos. These rationalizations revealed the complex psychological mechanisms that had allowed the guards to participate in atrocities for years. Many had developed elaborate mental frameworks that justified their actions or minimized their responsibility. Some had convinced themselves that they were protecting prisoners from worse fates, while others claimed that their actions had been necessary to maintain the security of the Reich. The most disturbing aspect of these conversations was how they revealed the guards' continued dehumanization of their victims. Even faced with the collapse of their world, many guards continued to refer to prisoners using the language of the camp system. They spoke of maintaining order and preventing chaos, as if their brutal treatment of prisoners had been a form of public service. As dawn approached on May 2nd, the various plans began to take shape. Some guards had already changed into civilian clothes. Others packed small bags with essentials. A few destroyed personal diaries and letters that might reveal their thoughts and attitudes during their service. The destruction of personal items was particularly revealing. Guards burned letters from family members that expressed support for their work, destroyed photographs that showed them in uniform, and eliminated any evidence of their personal relationships with other guards or camp officials. These actions demonstrated their understanding that their service at Ravensbruck was not something that could be easily explained or justified. The most chilling aspect of that night was the cold calculation involved in these decisions. These women, who had spent years implementing policies that resulted in the deaths of thousands, now applied the same methodical thinking to their own survival. They evaluated risks, considered options, and made choices based on what they believed would give them the best chance of avoiding justice. But their careful planning would soon be tested by the reality of the camp's final hours. The theoretical discussions of the night would give way to the harsh realities of a collapsing regime and the approach of Allied forces, who were already aware of the atrocities committed at Ravensbrück. May 2nd dawned with an eerie quiet that contrasted sharply with the usual sounds of the camp. The morning roll call was chaotic, with many guards absent from their posts. Those who remained faced the enormous challenge of maintaining control over a prisoner population that sensed liberation was near. Commandant Surin issued what would be his final orders to the female guard staff. The remaining prisoners were to be evacuated in groups, marched away from the advancing Soviet forces. But the logistics of this evacuation were nightmarish. Thousands of prisoners, many weak from years of malnutrition and abuse, would have to be moved quickly across countryside already crowded with refugees and retreating German forces. The evacuation order came too late to be effective. The camp's infrastructure was already collapsing, and the guard force was insufficient to manage such a massive undertaking. Many guards had already fled, and those who remained were demoralized and focused on their own survival rather than the implementation of orders. The female guards who remained faced an impossible situation. They were responsible for maintaining order during the evacuation, but their authority was crumbling. Some prisoners, sensing the change in circumstances, began to show subtle signs of defiance. Others, too weak to walk, would clearly be unable to participate in any evacuation march. The camp's medical facilities, such as they were, contained hundreds of prisoners who were too sick to be moved. The guards responsible for these areas faced particularly difficult decisions. Some chose to abandon their posts entirely, leaving the sick prisoners to their fate. Others attempted to maintain some semblance of order, but without the support of the camp's administrative structure, their efforts were largely futile. Maria Mandel, still officially in charge of the female guards, spent the morning dealing with a series of crises. Several guards had failed to report for duty, and others were openly discussing abandoning their posts. The careful discipline that had characterized the camp's operation for 6 years was dissolving. Mandel's attempts to maintain order revealed the extent to which the camp's authority structure had broken down. Guards who had previously obeyed her orders without question now challenged her authority or simply ignored her instructions. The fear that had once compelled obedience was now directed toward the approaching Allied forces, rather than the camp's internal hierarchy. The Austrian supervisor found herself in an impossible position. Her years of service had made her one of the most recognizable figures in the camp, and her reputation for cruelty was well established among the prisoner population. Flight might offer a chance of escape, but it would also mean abandoning the position of authority that had defined her identity for years. The evacuation began in the early afternoon. Columns of prisoners, guarded by the remaining female guards, began leaving the camp. But the process was chaotic and incomplete. Many prisoners, particularly those in the camp's makeshift hospital, were too sick to be moved. Others, sensing that liberation was imminent, attempted to hide or delay their departure. The first evacuation column consisted of approximately 2,000 prisoners, under the guard of about 50 female guards. The ratio of guards to prisoners was far lower than what had been maintained during the camp's normal operations, reflecting the depletion of the guard force. The guards who participated in this evacuation were mostly those who had been unable or unwilling to flee during the previous night. The evacuation route led northwest, away from the advancing Soviet forces, but the roads were already crowded with military vehicles and refugees, making progress slow and difficult. The guards found themselves struggling to maintain control over their prisoner columns, while navigating the chaos of Germany's collapse. For the female guards participating in the evacuation, the march represented their last official act as representatives of the Nazi regime. Some took this opportunity to commit final acts of cruelty, beating prisoners who moved too slowly or fell behind. Others seemed to recognize that their time was ending and showed uncharacteristic restraint. The behavior of individual guards during the evacuation revealed the range of responses to the regime's collapse. Some guards, particularly those who had been most enthusiastic supporters of Nazi ideology, seemed unable to accept that their world was ending. They continued to treat prisoners with the same brutality they had shown for years, as if maintaining their authority could somehow preserve the system they had served. Other guards began to show signs of the psychological strain they had been under for years. Some became increasingly erratic in their behavior, alternating between excessive cruelty and unexpected kindness. A few guards appeared to be suffering from complete mental breakdown, unable to process the magnitude of the changes occurring around them. The evacuation routes became scenes of tragedy. Prisoners who collapsed were often shot by guards who saw them as burdens that would slow the column. The roads became littered with bodies, creating a gruesome trail that would later serve as evidence of the guards' actions during the camp's final hours. The killings during the evacuation were not random acts of violence, but reflected the guards' continued adherence to the camp's brutal policies. Guards had been trained to view prisoners as expendable resources, and this training continued to influence their behavior, even as the system they served was collapsing. The deaths during the evacuation represented the final implementation of policies that had governed the camp for years. But even as they participated in these final atrocities, many guards were thinking about their own survival. Some used the confusion of the evacuation to slip away from their columns and disappear into the countryside. Others remained with their prisoner groups, perhaps hoping that their presence during the evacuation would be seen as evidence of their cooperation with orders rather than personal malice. The irony was stark. As they marched prisoners away from Ravensbruck, the female guards were also marching toward their own uncertain fate. The very roads they traveled would soon be controlled by Allied forces, and the uniforms they wore would mark them as war criminals. As the evacuation continued through the afternoon and evening of May 2nd, the relationships between the female guards began to fracture under the enormous pressure. The solidarity that had existed among them during their years of service dissolved as each woman focused on her own survival. Some guards began pointing fingers at their colleagues, claiming that others had been more brutal or more enthusiastic in their duties. These accusations, made in whispered conversations during brief rest stops, revealed the depth of fear that had gripped the group. Women who had worked together for years were now prepared to betray each other if it might improve their own chances of lenient treatment. The breakdown of loyalty among the guards was not entirely surprising. The camp system had always encouraged competition and suspicion among staff members as a way of maintaining control. Guards were rewarded for reporting on each other's activities, and advancement often came at the expense of colleagues. Now, faced with the prospect of capture and trial, these same dynamics were intensified. The most dramatic example of this betrayal occurred when guard supervisor Ruth Nudek was abandoned by her subordinates during the evacuation. Nudek, who had been responsible for training new female guards, found herself isolated when several guards under her command disappeared during the night. When she attempted to maintain control over her assigned prisoner group, she discovered that her authority had completely evaporated. Nudek's situation was particularly tragic because she had been genuinely devoted to what she believed was her duty. Unlike some guards who had joined the system for economic reasons or had been coerced into service, Nudek had been a true believer in Nazi ideology. Her dedication to the cause had made her an effective trainer and supervisor, but it also made her unwilling to abandon her post when flight might have saved her. The guards who abandoned Nudek did so with calculated precision. They waited until the evacuation column was in a remote area where their disappearance would not be immediately noticed. They took advantage of Nudek's commitment to her duties, knowing that she would not abandon her assigned prisoners to pursue them. Their betrayal was not emotional but strategic, designed to improve their own chances of escape. Other guards attempted to ingratiate themselves with prisoners, suddenly offering food or water to people they had previously tormented. These gestures were transparently self-serving, but they demonstrated how quickly the power dynamics within the camp had shifted. Guards who had once held absolute authority over prisoners' lives now found themselves dependent on those same prisoners' potential testimony about their behavior. The most calculating example of this behavior came from guard Hildegard Lachert, who had been known for her particularly sadistic treatment of prisoners. During the evacuation, she began approaching prisoners she had previously brutalized, offering them food, and claiming that she had always tried to help them when possible. Her attempts to rewrite history were so blatant that even prisoners who were focused on their own survival recognized the transparent nature of her deception. Lechert's behavior revealed the extent to which some guards were willing to abandon any sense of consistency or dignity in their desperate attempts to avoid accountability. She seemed to believe that her sudden kindness could somehow erase years of documented cruelty, demonstrating either remarkable self-deception or cynical calculation about the nature of post-war justice. The most calculating guards used the evacuation as an opportunity to position themselves strategically for the post-war period. Some guards began claiming that they had been forced to participate in the camp's operations against their will, and that they had tried to help prisoners whenever possible. These claims were often contradicted by the experiences of the prisoners themselves, but the guards hoped that the chaos of the collapse would make it difficult to verify their stories. These fabricated narratives were often elaborate and detailed. Guards claimed to have been resistance members working within the system, or insisted that they had been threatened with death if they refused to participate in atrocities. Some guards even claimed to have Jewish ancestry or communist sympathies, hoping that these false identities would protect them from prosecution. The evacuation columns themselves became increasingly disorganized as the hours passed. Guards abandoned their posts, prisoners escaped into the countryside, and the careful structure that had defined the camp's operation completely broke down. By the evening of May 2nd, what had started as an organized evacuation had become a confused retreat. The collapse of the evacuation revealed the artificial nature of the authority that had maintained the camp's operations for years. Without the support of the broader Nazi system, the guards found themselves unable to control even small groups of weakened prisoners. The fear and brutality that had maintained order within the camp were ineffective in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Some guards used this confusion to their advantage. They shed their uniforms, adopted false identities, and melted into the stream of refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. Others, perhaps paralyzed by the magnitude of the decision, continued to march with their prisoner groups even as their authority disappeared. The guards who chose to flee during the evacuation demonstrated the most cold-blooded calculation. They abandoned their responsibilities and their colleagues at the moment when solidarity might have provided some protection. Their actions revealed that their years of service had been motivated by self-interest, rather than genuine commitment to any cause or ideology. The betrayals of that final day would have lasting consequences. When Allied investigators later attempted to reconstruct the events at Ravensbrück, they often found that the guards' own testimonies contradicted each other. The women who had once presented a united front in implementing the camp's brutal policies were now eager to shift blame to their former colleagues. As night fell on May 2nd, the last organized resistance of the female guards was crumbling, but their final hours of freedom would reveal even more about their character and their choices. The bonds that had held them together as a group were dissolving under the pressure of imminent capture, and each woman was now focused solely on her own survival. The night of May 2nd to 3rd marked the final collapse of organized Nazi authority at Ravensbrück. For the female guards still in the area, this night represented their last chance to escape before Allied forces arrived. The decisions made during these crucial hours would determine whether they faced justice or managed to disappear into the chaos of post-war Germany. Dorothea Binz, who had been methodically planning her escape, made her final move during the early hours of May 3rd. She abandoned her prisoner column during a rest stop and vanished into the darkness, carrying false papers and wearing civilian clothes. Her escape was carefully planned and executed, demonstrating the same methodical approach she had applied to her duties as a guard. Binz's escape plan had been months in the making. She had cultivated relationships with local civilians who could provide safe houses and transportation. Her false identity papers identified her as a displaced person from the Eastern Territories, a common cover story that would explain her presence in the area without proper documentation. She had even arranged for a change of appearance, cutting and dyeing her hair to alter her distinctive look. The young guard's escape was facilitated by a network of sympathizers who remained loyal to the Nazi cause even as the regime collapsed. These individuals, mostly local residents who had supported the party, provided safe houses and transportation for fleeing officials. Their continued support demonstrated that the ideological foundations of the regime had not entirely disappeared with its military defeat. But Binz's escape was not unique. Throughout the night, individual guards and small groups made similar decisions. They calculated that their chances of avoiding capture were better if they fled immediately, rather than waiting for the inevitable Allied arrival. Some headed west, hoping to reach American or British lines where they believed treatment might be more lenient than under Soviet control. The guards' escape routes were carefully planned to avoid major roads and populated areas. They traveled through forests and agricultural areas, moving at night and hiding during the day. Many had studied maps of the region and identified safe houses and supply caches that could support their flight. The level of preparation suggested that escape plans had been in development for weeks or even months. The guards who remained faced increasingly desperate circumstances. The evacuation had largely collapsed, with prisoner columns scattered across the countryside. Many guards found themselves effectively prisoners themselves, trapped with groups of inmates who no longer recognized their authority but were too weak or confused to take action against them. The breakdown of the evacuation created surreal situations where guards and prisoners were essentially traveling together as refugees. Some guards attempted to maintain their authority through force, but others recognized that their best chance of survival lay in cooperation with the prisoners they had previously tormented. These temporary alliances were fragile and often broke down when the guards' true identities were revealed. During this final night, some guards attempted to destroy the last evidence of their crimes. They burned documents, disposed of personal items that might identify them, and tried to eliminate any trace of their involvement in the camp's operations. But these efforts were largely futile. The scale of the evidence was too vast to eliminate completely. The destruction of evidence revealed the guards' understanding that their actions at Ravensbruck had been criminal rather than legitimate military or administrative duties. Guards who had previously claimed to be following orders now demonstrated their awareness that those orders had been illegal by their desperate attempts to hide their participation in carrying them out. The most revealing aspect of this final night was how it exposed the guards' true attitudes toward their service. Away from the formal structure of the camp, without the support of their superiors, many guards showed their real feelings about what they had done. Some expressed regret, but others remained defiant, insisting that they had been performing necessary duties. The guards who expressed regret during these final hours revealed the psychological strain they had been under throughout their service. Many had suppressed their doubts and moral qualms in order to function within the camp system. Now, faced with the collapse of that system, they were forced to confront the reality of their actions without the protective framework of official authority. A few guards made desperate attempts to reinvent themselves during these final hours. They claimed to have been resistance members working within the system, or insisted that they had been forced to serve against their will. These claims were generally unconvincing, but they demonstrated the lengths to which some guards would go to avoid responsibility for their actions. The most elaborate of these reinventions came from guard supervisor Anna Klein, who claimed to have been secretly documenting atrocities for eventual prosecution of camp officials. She produced a hidden diary that supposedly contained evidence of war crimes committed by her colleagues. Investigation would later reveal that the diary had been fabricated during the camp's final days, but Klein's attempt demonstrated the sophistication of some guards' deception efforts. As dawn approached on May 3rd, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance. For the female guards still in the area, time was running out. Some made last-minute decisions to flee, while others resigned themselves to capture. A few attempted to blend in with the prisoner population, hoping that their captors would not be able to distinguish between guards and inmates. The guards who attempted to disguise themselves as prisoners faced the immediate problem of their physical condition. Years of adequate nutrition and relative comfort had left them obviously different from the malnourished and sick prisoners they were trying to impersonate. Their attempts at disguise were generally unsuccessful and often resulted in violent confrontations with actual prisoners who recognized them. The final hours before liberation revealed the full spectrum of human behavior under extreme pressure. Some guards showed courage, others demonstrated cowardice, and many simply tried to survive by whatever means available. But regardless of their individual responses, they all faced the same inevitable conclusion. Their time as instruments of the Nazi regime was ending. The approaching liberation forces represented not just military defeat, but moral judgment. The guards understood that they would be held accountable not just for their actions, but for their choices. The system they had served was collapsing, and they would have to answer for their participation in its crimes as individuals, rather than as representatives of state authority. May 3rd, 1945, brought the end of Ravensbrück as a functioning concentration camp. Soviet forces arrived to find a scene of devastation and chaos. The carefully organized system that had operated for 6 years had completely collapsed, leaving behind evidence of systematic brutality and the scattered remnants of both the guard force and the prisoner population. The Soviet liberators faced the enormous task of sorting through the confusion they encountered. Thousands of prisoners remained in the camp or in the surrounding area, many requiring immediate medical attention. The guards who had not fled were mixed among the prisoners, some still in uniform, others having changed into civilian clothes or even prisoner garb. The first Soviet units to reach the camp were advanced reconnaissance forces who were not prepared for the scale of what they discovered. The evidence of systematic murder, medical experiments, and brutality was overwhelming. The soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were shocked by the conditions they found and the stories told by survivors. The camp's liberation was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over several days. Soviet forces secured the immediate area, established medical facilities for survivors, and began the complex task of identifying and processing the various groups of people they found. The distinction between guards, prisoners, and civilians was not always immediately clear. The identification of former guards became a crucial task for the Allied forces. Surviving prisoners played a vital role in this process, pointing out guards who had been particularly brutal or who had tried to disguise their identities. The guards' attempts to blend in with the prisoner population were largely unsuccessful, as their physical condition and demeanor often betrayed their true roles. The prisoner identification process was complicated by the fact that many survivors were too weak or traumatized to provide coherent testimony immediately. Some prisoners were reluctant to identify guards, fearing retaliation even after liberation. Others were eager to point out their tormentors, but were sometimes mistaken in their identifications due to the stress and confusion of the situation. Maria Mandel, who had remained in the area longer than many of her subordinates, was among the first senior guards to be identified and arrested. Her attempts to claim that she had been trying to help prisoners were met with skepticism from both Allied investigators and surviving inmates who remembered her actions during the camp's operation. Mandel's arrest was dramatic and well documented. She was found hiding in a barn near the camp, wearing civilian clothes and carrying false identification papers. When confronted by Soviet soldiers, she initially claimed to be a displaced person from Austria. Her deception was quickly exposed when several survivors immediately recognized her despite her civilian disguise. The Austrian supervisor's capture revealed the inadequacy of the escape plans that many guards had developed. Her false papers were poorly forged. Her civilian clothes were too clean and well-fitted for someone who had supposedly been fleeing for days. And her physical condition was obviously different from that of genuine refugees. Most importantly, her face was too well known to the survivor community for any disguise to be effective. The guards who had fled during the final days faced a different fate. Some, like Dorothea Binz, managed to evade capture for months or even years, but the Allied commitment to tracking down war criminals meant that many would eventually be found. The false identities and civilian clothes that had seemed like salvation during the camp's final hours proved to be only temporary protection. The manhunt for escaped guards was systematic and thorough. Allied intelligence services compiled lists of known guards, distributed photographs, and established networks of informants among the refugee population. The guards who had fled found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when their past would catch up with them. The immediate aftermath of liberation revealed the full extent of the guards' crimes. The mass graves, the evidence of medical experiments, and the testimonies of survivors painted a picture of systematic brutality that shocked even experienced Allied investigators. The female guards' claims that they had been just following orders or had been forced to participate against their will were difficult to reconcile with the evidence of their enthusiastic participation in the camp's operations. The documentation of evidence was a massive undertaking. Allied investigators photographed crime scenes, collected physical evidence, and conducted thousands of interviews with survivors. The guards' attempts to destroy evidence during the camp's final days had been only partially successful, and the remaining documentation provided a detailed picture of the camp's operations. Some guards attempted to cooperate with Allied investigators, providing information about the camp's operations and the whereabouts of other guards. But these efforts at cooperation were often self-serving, designed to reduce their own culpability, rather than to genuinely assist in the pursuit of justice. The guards who chose to cooperate faced a difficult balancing act. They needed to provide enough information to be useful to investigators, while avoiding admissions that would implicate them in serious crimes. Many guards attempted to portray themselves as reluctant participants who had been forced to follow orders, while simultaneously providing detailed information about the actions of their colleagues. The arrest and interrogation of the guards marked the beginning of a legal process that would continue for years. The evidence gathered during these initial investigations would form the basis for war crimes trials that would hold the guards accountable for their actions. But the immediate priority was simply to establish what had happened and to ensure that those responsible did not escape justice. The liberation of Ravensbrück and the capture of its guards represented more than just the end of one concentration camp. It symbolized the broader collapse of the Nazi regime and the beginning of a reckoning with the crimes committed in its name. For the female guards, their final 24 hours of freedom had determined whether they would face that reckoning immediately or after a period of flight and hiding. The captured guards found themselves in a completely reversed situation from their years of service. They were now the prisoners, subject to interrogation and investigation by the very forces they had been trained to hate and fear. The psychological adjustment to this reversal was difficult for many guards, who had become accustomed to wielding absolute authority over others. In the aftermath of Ravensbruck's liberation, legal proceedings began swiftly, with captured guards interrogated and their testimonies revealing a mix of denial, self-preservation, and blame-shifting. These early interviews laid the groundwork for the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trial in 1946, a British military tribunal where 16 former staff, many of them female guards, faced charges for crimes against humanity. The trial exposed the brutal reality of life in the camp. Survivor testimonies contradicted the guards' frequent claims of ignorance or unwilling participation. More than 100 witnesses, including survivors and investigators, helped build detailed profiles of the accused. Evidence from interrogations and camp records showed that many guards had not only followed orders, but often exceeded them with personal zeal. Among the most notorious was Dorothea Binz, who had initially evaded capture before being arrested in 1946. Her trial testimony revealed the calculated nature of her crimes. While she claimed coercion, numerous survivors described her as a willing and sadistic participant in beatings, selections, and punishments. Her arrest had uncovered a broader escape network that helped Nazi officials disappear in the post-war chaos. Testimonies also highlighted the hierarchy among the guards. Senior figures like Maria Mandel and Binz wielded independent authority and often made decisions about prisoner treatment. Others, like Ruth Closius, admitted they knew their actions were illegal, but justified them as serving state security. These claims were countered by survivors who detailed acts of cruelty that far exceeded any military or administrative requirement. One particularly damning testimony came from survivor Violette Lecoq, who recounted how Binz personally chose her for punishment over a minor rule violation. Her vivid translated account left little doubt about the intentional cruelty behind the guards' actions. Even as the Nazi regime collapsed, many guards adjusted their behavior in self-serving ways, some becoming harsher, others suddenly attempting to appear sympathetic to prisoners. But their testimonies during the trial still reflected deep-rooted Nazi ideology. Many used dehumanizing language to describe inmates, revealing how fully they had internalized the propaganda that enabled their crimes. Mandel's own defense, that she had tried to protect prisoners, was contradicted by both survivor accounts and documentary evidence, including execution orders she signed. Her trial, like others, illustrated the stark contrast between what the guards claimed and what the evidence revealed. Despite efforts to destroy records in the camp's final days, investigators were able to piece together enough documentation and witness testimony to establish a clear pattern of systemic brutality. The trials proved that the guards were not passive participants, but active, willing agents of Nazi violence. Claims of just following orders collapsed under cross-examination, as did excuses of ignorance and coercion. In the end, Binz, Mandel, and others were convicted and sentenced, some to death, others to long prison terms. Their executions in 1947 brought a grim end to the story of Ravensbrück's female guards, and their trials set enduring precedents in international law regarding individual responsibility for crimes against humanity. The final hours of the female guards at Ravensbrück, along with their post-war trials, offer lasting insight into how ordinary people can become agents of atrocity. Their organized attempts to escape justice mirrored the same planning and initiative they had shown as camp staff, evidence that their participation was deliberate and not merely the result of coercion or ignorance. Post-war psychological profiles revealed that many guards came from ordinary backgrounds, maids, factory workers, clerks, but had been transformed by ideological training and gradual desensitization. Camp indoctrination taught them to view prisoners as subhuman, normalizing violence and suppressing moral resistance. This transformation was slow, methodical, and disturbingly effective. Their testimonies, despite being self-serving, became essential historical records. They revealed details about camp structure, policy enforcement, and interpersonal dynamics that might have been lost otherwise. Even as they tried to downplay their roles, their statements offered critical evidence of how the Nazi system operated from the ground up. The guards' swift loss of authority after the Nazi collapse showed how much the camps depended not just on top-down power, but on the willing participation of lower-level staff. Their actions highlighted the dangers of moral disengagement within institutional systems. Legally, The Ravensbrück trials helped establish enduring international standards. Just following orders was no longer a valid defense for war crimes. These principles were foundational to the Nuremberg trials and influenced later prosecutions of crimes against humanity. Psychologically, the guards' final behaviors showed common patterns: denial, self-justification, fantasy, and in rare cases, shallow remorse. Their stories illustrate how gradual exposure to violence, group conformity, and ideological belief can suppress empathy and moral reasoning. Their final hours also revealed the Nazis' desperate attempt to erase evidence, but survivor testimonies and preserved records ensured that their crimes could not be forgotten. These legal and historical processes preserved memory, honored victims, and underscored the importance of truth and accountability. In their final hours and post-war trials, the female guards revealed striking psychological patterns of denial and moral disengagement. Despite years of brutality, many still framed their actions as duty and protection of society, reflecting deep internalization of Nazi ideology. They used dehumanizing language, downplayed personal responsibility, and clung to false narratives, portraying themselves as reluctant participants or even protectors. These weren't just lies, but attempts to preserve a positive self-image. Psychologists noted moral numbing, a reduced emotional response to violence, enabling continued atrocities. The guards' roles had given them purpose and status, and the collapse of the regime shattered their identities. Some denied everything or retreated into fantasy. Others gave detailed but self-justifying accounts. True remorse was rare. Many had been psychologically average before the war, showing how ideology and institutional power can reshape moral judgment. Their final behavior offers a chilling insight into how ordinary individuals become complicit in evil and struggle to face it when the system falls apart. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.